documentary is something of an anomaly, but that would only make sense as it matches the tones and vibrations of its subject, me, a being that for all intents and purposes is quite the anomaly, unarguably so. I've put this off for so long. I suppose I should begin with some prefatory note explaining to you that this work is the composite autobiography of an alpha spirit, rather than singularly concerning the present corporeal body, a mere genetic vehicle that is more readily identifiable with its author-editor. Well, see, that's the problem with even doing this, is I know how fluffy and ridiculous, bizarre it's going to sound for most of the people, and that type of reaction is already expected, but I also happen to know that this has been long anticipated, expected, prophetically, predicted by quite a few, and so it's for them that we're really going to have to do this for, and it'll be interesting. But there's no doubt going to be further questions, bombardment of the office with more correspondence seeking to verify or validate this, when it's all said and done. And I don't know. I've withheld it for so long that there's going to be nothing more to be really said about it once it's all said and done. It is what it is. It's basically the final word. For those of you watching that are as yet unfamiliar with my use of terminology, the alpha spirit is not even what most people think of regarding that truer, more eternal self that occupies the body. The genetic and ancestral memory of the body is actually what most are tapping into, even when they work with their own past lives and regressions into genetic healing using contemporary New Age methods. This is not necessarily able to be labeled invalid or incorrect, but it does still tend to deal with an energy that lingers more closely with the physical form one takes on in life than what their actual spirit is concerned with beyond this mortal existence. So my historical role with the Anunnaki is something of an anomaly in and of itself. It's even more so than my attempt to actually disclose it at this point. I mean, kind of personalized tale, but I'm in the awkward position of finding myself using terms like they and them and regarding these beings versus myself. And this is kind of part of the story too. And there's a long history of separations between me and them. And some of the reasoning for this is going to obviously become self-evident, with the telling of the tale. But you gotta understand this isn't an oversight either. There's an obvious reason why it is difficult to equate myself with them, especially in this current form I occupy. But difficulty I often find in truly identifying with them actually runs deeper and has both philosophical and biological sides to it, as I hope to help people understand. For those not already familiar with the term, Anunnaki means literally heaven comes down to earth, and is an ancient Mesopotamian originating term. It was used to describe the race that they interpreted, and were actually well programmed to interpret, as sky gods. This semantics is quite accurate, though it could actually be used to encompass much more than simply a singular race, as many things come down from heaven now, as various species are described by folks separated as Greys and Syrians and reptilians and so on and so forth. And yeah, material existence has a lot going on in it. In spite of all that, the more recent, geologically recent, divine encounters between humans and ancient aliens that appear in popular mythologies actually do heavily rely on a specific Anunnaki family, the one that the word was coined for. So, the Anunnaki, as I and most refer to them, as well as beings like them, are in essence very self-aware alpha spirits. And this is important to understand to truly get my story, because more than simply being this highly advanced race of aliens that happened upon the planet Earth and decided to set up camp, these are often the same figures that assisted in the actual manifestation of many of the originating systems of material existence as a whole, as purely alpha spirits, prior to their choosing to inhabit a physical form as a means of interacting with said existence. Now, I can't be sure if this is the same tendency that was later instilled in humans, but for some reason there is this inclination to do because it can be done. So the means for infinite manifestation were essentially there to begin with and manipulated by the highest minds in the universe. The problem with the selection of corporeal existences and bodies was an issue that if I had been around, would have been easily been able to point out. And the problem is, once you get in, how do you get out? And they've even made a Simpsons episode about this. The little genius Lisa shrinking down to be able to experience a realm she in essence created and then getting stuck there. The reality is, however, slightly more complicated, since we found that the longer material existence is interacted with, the more strongly the alpha spirit would assimilate the material environment, especially the simulacrum being inhabited. Essentially, a physical existence proved addicting and caused you to forget who you were. How shocking. Seriously, some things never change. They just duplicate, divide, and grow. The reason the Anunnaki were able to manipulate time-space and then even physically appear as they did to ancient humans goes back to the very reason they are thought to be alien in the first place. We are talking about a superior intelligence of material systems, in addition to being able to further manipulate programs from the inside and employ advanced technologies. I don't even think if you were to ask most people who, if they knew who Marduk was, if they could even tell you. It's not a very large part of human consciousness and understanding at this juncture. There's the Swedish thrash metal band, and some loose references in mythology, the Simon Necronomicon, but even within academicians, looking back at the records, the names for these figures amongst various languages and cultures were all different. Plus, they were very much interested in titles, and so within a specific cultural framework, the same being might have innumerable names to refer to the same being. A more ancient name for Marduk, translated from the cuneiform to the Semitic, is Mulukai, where the derivatives Maluk and Malek can be drawn. Even Marduk, also Merodach, is an Akkadian Semitic phonetic drawn from the Assyrians Marduk, meaning son of the pure white mound, referring to the artificial mountains that were being constructed on Earth, which further proves that all of the names by which humans come to know the Anunnaki by are essentially personas. This is important to note because the name may indeed be the way in which history has recorded him, with a little thanks to me as I'll explain in due time, but is not the true name, just as he appeared in other parts of the world under other names, as did I, and just as Anu, meaning something in your language like Heavenly One, is not really the actual name of Anu, and was a title taken due to the position he held with the Anunnaki when they began settling here, and their legacy began being recorded for the sake of humans, and so on. If you look at the meanings held by the Sumerians in regard to those like Enlil and Enki, you can see that they, in this case, are across the board concerning human records of the ancient pantheon are simply titles. Any real disharmony in the original history of the Anunnaki is really one of usurpation for the greater good. It's seldom out of simple jealousy or the lust for power in the way in which humans might experience it. I mean, with the Anunnaki, it's always been about honor and nobility and concerning their time to rule in various ways. So these are factors that, there's important to understand the family aspects of it. There's obviously the scorn and discord and familial aspects that you would find with any such group. But really, prior to the existence of modern humans, there was little on the planet to even fight over. and humans would not even be what they are now, the genetic beings they are now, had they not received this massive genetic upgrade from the Anunnaki during the time of the Igigi, and specifically the ancient Mardukite faction, including Enki. And consequently and ironically, if humans had not really been created as they are, I would never have been either, which is in part going back to the distinction between me and them. And I don't even mean just in like the form that I am, as in the preservation of humanity into this day, but in the original times, my original appearance in ancient times. It's my turn to fly. Father, be with me tonight. As my previous writings have accounted, and certainly enough literary transliterations have been recovered from museums in the current age to validate, we acknowledge what is known as the supernal trinity of Anu, Enlil, and Enki. This was not always the way of heaven, but by the time of humans and myself, this was the power system installed. Anu is recognized as the Allfather to the Anunnaki family that sparked Mesopotamian civilization, among others, though he remained distant to the physical activities taking place on Earth. By mortal standards, the house of Anu became the entire abode of heaven, leaving his sons Enlil and Enki to order the local universe and mundane worldly systems. So, to the best of my knowledge, and this comes up quite a bit actually, the Anunnaki as a family, as a genetic race of beings, does indeed come from what you would call Sirius, the Sirius star system, which is Canis Major, but many forms in the cosmos actually do, and this is not particularly unique. There's also a relationship to nearby Orion, as some would already expect already. And as we've already been bogged down into mortal semantics, I might as well continue saying that basically what you would call Sirians are the Saurians. Since contemporary consciousness has already become kind of accustomed to this reptilian mode of thinking, what mortals call aliens, but the Sirians are notorious for diplomacy and politics and religion, and specifically the dynasty of An. And this has ended up being passed to the dynasty of Ib, and by way of Enlil, according to the laws of dynastic succession. Although Enki was technically the older of the two brothers, the power passed to Enlil because of his bloodline, basically being true to the Syrians, son of Anu and Antu, by the names they were given in Sumerian language. A key figure to the Enlilite dynasty was a half-sister to Enki and Enlil named Ninmah, also Ninhursag, who is technically the mother of Ninurta, heir to Enlilship in the Sumerian pantheon and not Ninmah. It is an attempt to produce a royal heir on his own that Enki even tried to court Ninmah, but apparently was unsuccessful. She became the consort of Enlil for a time. The text I once recorded for them concerning the king list listed Enki's consort, my grandmother, as Damkina or Ninki, daughter of Alalu, the ruler prior to Anu. As I must profess again, I was not there to take genetic samples and do the genealogies myself. I simply wrote what I was told or what I could find concerning the Ancient of Days, which to me is practically everything before my ancient birth. Therefore, what I'm about to tell you is not in any of the records, but is somehow the case, and I am assuming because of Ninki, unless facts are still being hidden from me, which is indeed sometimes the case, but Marduk is only half Syrian. So one of the versions of basically a cosmogenetic political account we supplied to people in ancient times concerning the basis of raising Marduk to supremacy in Babylon. There's this famous story involving a dragon, which he is supposed to have slain, and it's actually identified as his mother. And religious connotations aside, this was kind of meant to be a clue, though not literal, of course. The dragon slaying event didn't actually take place in material existence, and it was really devised to accumulate worldly power, as I'll further explain in due time, but it was, in truth, it really showed that Marduk was half draconian from the Draco region of space-time. And that's now strongly tied to what folks know as the Great Bear, Ursa Major. And the draconian races are often distinguished by their affinity for natural sciences, mystical philosophies, mainly the intellectual fire or dragon mind. And this being said, someone familiar with some of my past writings on the subject, or even the general subject at all, might begin to understand some of the duality that later came to be, you know, instilled in the consciousness that separated the younger generation of elder gods, those descended from Enlil and Enki, from their ancestors. So this interstellar nature of the Anunnaki can be confusing when, comparing them to like the alpha spirit form that humans would describe as subtle energy or etheric. Many of these beings reached what they considered to be the limitations of existential creation from the outside and chose instead to begin experiencing it for themselves within material existence. Yeah, essentially, it's the nature of the Anunnaki and really any alpha spirit to manifest creations and facsimiles into existence and to put large systems into order. And this is important to understand when learning how the Anunnaki affected human civilization and the evolution of humanity, because as living systems become more complicated, so did the programming that was required to sustain it. And as humans enter the equation, then the systems become more complicated. As population grows, and things get really complicated. Where Enlil led the command of the Anunnaki councils and supervised the original ventures and physical constructions on the planet, it was Enki who acted the part of chief scientist, concerning himself with the living genetics on the planet, the physical minerals, and the resources available, and of course the best use of all of these. The royalty was again being held by the Enlilite branch of the Anunnaki tree, and for a long while there was no debate about this. The two brothers, Enlil and Enki, worked together as one in the establishment of a functional planet fit for the gods. But there was much work to be done, and the Anunnaki court was a bit too refined themselves to make this all happen. So they employed some help. Originally, before the modern human being had been brought forth, the Anunnaki sought the aid of another force, one a little closer to home. The original name of this force is obscure, though they might be best recognizable in your religious mythologies as an angelic army of sorts. The official count of the Igigi workers in the Revolt of the Gods can be found in the Mardukite Necronomicon Anunnaki Bible, which includes the original Sumerian transliteration of this. But for a time, they're actually responsible for the initial mining, agricultural, all the initial construction efforts on the planet. And when the years grow too numerous and the work is not subsiding, they decide that it's simply too much for them to do, and they were tired of doing it. I mean, they were gods, and this whole idea of physical work in a material universe from the vantage point of a physical body. It just proved a little too intense, as opposed to willing creation into being as purely alpha spirits. So this revolt actually led to the genetic upgrade of humans to be the new workers. And by this time, the group, the Anunnaki group that was originally doing the work, they assumed this name known as the Igigi, which essentially is those who see, meaning overseers of humanity, and they come to serve a different function. Marduk is one of the youngest of the true Anunnaki who actually came from the heavens before the earth had been named. I was actually born here, at a time after the earth had been named, and after the Adamu had already been brought forth, and basically after the Anunnaki had already started getting themselves in over their heads with the forthcoming humans. For this reason, even shutting aside any thoughts of a mortal self currently occupied or otherwise, my first consciousness awareness fragmentation was always on the planet Earth, and as a conscious being, I didn't come from the heavens as my ancestors could more properly be said to have. Thus the separation often of me using myself versus them, but my coming about was the end result of something that actually caused an uproar in heaven and on earth, something that was completely unthinkable at the time. Marduk chose for his consort my a priori mother, an earthling human.
It's my turn to fly. Father, be with me tonight.
This task of revealing who I am and the mysteries that I keep concerning the Anunnaki and this world, I've put it off for a very long time. 3 years since even the founding of the modern Mardukite movement that I've withheld information, and I've done it as long as I possibly could, in fact. I can tell you that being who I am really bears no glory, and would you believe me if I said that the position I hold brings no worldly wealth or power? And so where am I gaining by any deception? And how do I explain what it means to be who I am amidst a world of false prophets? For naturally, you live among that vile and perverse generation, and they usually all are, that demands a sign. And yet the only ones we have been bidden to give you are all around you, and humanity continues to miss them at every turn, mistaking something for something else, and failing to see the reality before their very eyes. So what does someone say except, gee, why is it that people are always claiming to be someone famous in a past life? And we know that many of the claims are, of course, ridiculous that have come down the pike in the past. But the fallacy remains that if you are coming forth with a story, then it better be about, at the very least, an interesting life, right? I mean, people have flashbacks all the time, but if it isn't cohesive and significant, why would you share it? So I think I deserve a little credit here. And my situation is, really quite different in that respect. Well, clearly in divulging, disclosing my position, before I can really even explain the relevancy of like what I've done, in this lifetime, it's all about going back to the beginning for me. And so for people to even understand, Nabu in ancient times, you have to understand Babylon. To understand Babylon, you have to understand Marduk, understand that, the Anunnaki, and so all of this kind of comes together to play this cohesive story. And before it could even really be dealt with, enough had to be relayed in the other Mardukite work, enough had to be, brought together so that we would have the stuff to draw from later and be able to relay to people. And it was something, my position was actually withheld for a long time. It was thought to be a distraction if it was to be incorporated. And so what ended up happening was all of the Mardukite work was pretty much treated academically and professionally for a very long time, with leaving my unique position out of the equation. And so the information of it was withheld. There were people that were working closest with us the last couple of years that obviously knew, but it was not something that was the emphasis of the movement in and of itself. And so it's not like a movement oriented towards that. That wasn't my purpose. But for my purpose, my disclosure, my information, my story to have any relevance, it really went back to Marduk and establishing that in human consciousness for modern times. I mentioned prior that in spite of installing myself into the Babylonian pantheon system, one which me and my own priesthood devised to help in maintaining Anunnaki control over humanity, I hardly feel as though Anunnaki is a fitting word appropriate for me, not having come from the stars directly and being born to an Earth Mother who is also installed as a Mardukite goddess of Babylon, Sarpanit. Prior to the last great extermination of mankind, which I would estimate at 12,000 years ago by your understanding of time, maybe more, the Anunnaki had already been working with Earth genetics for hundreds of thousands of years. Again, maybe longer. The recording of Anunnaki events by Earth time standards can be quite difficult when compared to celestial time. Humans are mostly aware, or unaware, that their perception of fixed time has actually changed since the Anunnaki first began visiting the planet. It actually has. But anyways, primitive workers that were less intelligent than modern humans were arrived at early on, after a lengthy process of repeated strains and mistakes. This was authorized by Enki, who performed all of the scientific experiments personally, as well as with several assistants, including Marduk and other members of the family. After the settlement of planet Earth, Marduk had reserved himself to becoming the assistant to his father towards his worldly endeavors, thus leaving the military ranks in the Igigi and becoming the first priest of Urdu. As a result, he was able to expand his already significant stores of knowledge by learning the technologies, or magic, that Enki was proficient in. Father and son immediately began working on the magnum opus, involving the mixing of Anunnaki genetics directly with Homo sapien, the form what anthropologists call Homo sapien sapien. Completely unique and highly improved on all pre-existing human upgrade attempts, significant genetic manipulation was done to advance the being to the height that it could be without jeopardizing the protection of the Anunnaki race. Humans couldn't ever be allowed to be too smart, too aware. So like a lot of what we would call today open source programming, open source systems were installed into human consciousness in the very beginning, but never really fully actualized until folks like me later came along, able to influence the programming of human consciousness in ancient times. Now, this made their magnum opus, Adapa, kind of more perfect than what the individuals could generally aspire to throughout human history thereafter. Adapa was not programmed to be a limited being from the start. And at one juncture, he could even have been as one like the gods, eternal in heaven, but he remained on earth. And while the history of Adapa is fairly accessible, I mean, even our Necronomicon Anunnaki Bible among the Mardukites actually includes the tablet transliterations of this. The significance of a few of his descendants is not as accessible to people. From the 7th generation of Adapa, there's one who is known as Enki, but this name's kind of lost to the realm of legend and so forth. If you've been following around, if you're kind of a scholar or researcher related to the mysteries prior, then it's quite likely you've happed upon references and texts of these various figures, but usually, like in the case of Enki, Adapa, and so forth, it's usually better known by its Semitic originating name, like Enoch. And yes, Enoch, or Enki, 7th generation human from Adapa, spent considerable time with Enki and Marduk, learning the sciences of the gods and the knowledge that, by general Anunnaki standards, would have been pretty much forbidden to humans, as this was kind of still a time before civilization had been given over to humankind, or more correctly, installed in human consciousness. One of the things in this discourse, I go back, or I involve these names like Enki and Adapa and the story and whatnot to interrelate to my own. And so you might be wondering why all this obscure knowledge. Well, Enki had a daughter named Sarpanit. And there you have how it all interrelates.